You know, guys at work always ask me how I managed to bag my wife. They look at me, a married guy with a kid who, not gonna lie, takes pretty good care of himself, and they just assume it was a total breeze. Back in the early 2010s, around 2013, I was living in Vinh Cu, Dong Nai, and honestly, dating was just too damn easy for me, so I started looking for a real challenge. I wanted someone who couldn't stand my guts, just for the thrill of the chase, but man, I had no idea I'd end up needing literal ghost intervention to finally marry this girl. I was in my early 20s back then. I had a decent job and I was just overly confident. I thought I could charm my way into anything. Then I met her. Let us call her Harper. Harper was absolutely not interested in me at all. She thought guys who cared about their looks were totally unreliable, and she completely brushed me off for months. It took me a solid 3 or 4 months of relentless begging and proving myself just to get her to agree to hang out with me. But even then, there was a massive catch. Her family was traditional to an extreme level. They were strict in a way that is hard to even explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. They strictly forbade her from having a boyfriend while she was still studying. Her family was not exactly rich, but they had this massive, interconnected compound out in the countryside. It was this vast stretch of land where all her relatives lived right next to each other. Her dad owned a huge rice paddy, her aunt had the vegetable fields right next to it, and her uncle owned the adjacent plot. It was basically a private village. The only way in was this incredibly narrow dirt path, maybe a little over 6 feet wide. You absolutely could not fit a car down there. It was just this raised embankment cutting through endless dark fields and scattered burial plots. Because her parents were so strict, our entire relationship had to be a giant secret. Every time I drove her home on my scooter, I had to kill the engine and drop her off like 50 yards away from her actual front gate. We would stand there in the dark, whispering for a few minutes while the mosquitoes ate us alive, and then she would walk the rest of the way alone, while I had to turn my bike around and leave. It was so incredibly frustrating. I kept pushing her and begging her to just introduce me to her family as her official boyfriend. I tried to argue that I was a decent guy with a stable job, but she would just shake her head and tell me that her parents would absolutely lose their minds. I was constantly sweating my crap out on that dirt road, feeling like some sneaky criminal just for dating a girl. Things really took a weird turn on the day her family hosted a major death anniversary for her great-grandfather. In our culture, these anniversaries are massive events. The whole extended family gathers, they cook a feast, and they burn incense to honor the dead. I begged Harper to let me come and use the event as an excuse to introduce myself to her parents. She immediately shot the idea down, completely terrified that her parents would cause a massive scene and ruin the entire memorial in front of all the relatives. Since I was banned from the house, I just waited it out. The memorial happened during the day, so I drove out there late in the afternoon, parked my usual 50 yards away, and picked her up to go into the city for a bit. We hung out, got some food, and I brought her back pretty late. I do not remember the exact time, maybe past 9:14 p.m. or something like that. The drive back to her family compound was always miserable at night. There were 0 streetlights. You were completely at the mercy of your scooter headlight, which barely cut through the thick humidity and the dust. The raised dirt path was surrounded by pitch-black rice paddies on both sides, and it felt like you were driving on a tightrope over a black ocean. Right on the side of this dirt path, there was this one specific tomb. It was not just a regular dirt mound. It was this huge, heavy concrete structure, built up high like a miniature house. I had driven past this thing literally hundreds of times over the past few months. I was navigating the bumpy road, squinting into the darkness, when my headlights swept over the concrete tomb. I saw this blurry, white figure standing right next to it. My brain immediately tried to rationalize it. I figured it was just some guy from the neighborhood wearing a white button-down shirt, or maybe a traditional white tunic, out there cleaning the grave. But the timing was so bizarre. I blurted out to Harper that it was super weird for some old guy to be out here doing yard work at a grave in the pitch black. I felt Harper shift on the back of the bike. She peered over my shoulder and asked me what the heck I was talking about. I took one hand off the handlebars and pointed straight at the tomb. telling her to look at the guy standing right there. She immediately smacked me hard on the back. She was genuinely furious. She scolded me, telling me to stop messing around and that it was an incredibly sick joke to make because that specific tomb belonged to her great-grandfather, and today was literally his death anniversary. I felt this cold knot form in my stomach because I was absolutely not joking. As we rolled slowly past the tomb, I could not stop myself from turning my head to look back. My eyes locked onto the figure. It was an old man. He looked ancient, maybe 80 or 90 years old, with thin white hair and a wispy white beard. He was standing there perfectly still, with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The detail that made my skin crawl was his face. His eyebrows were drawn together in this deep, furious scowl, and he was staring dead at me. Not at the bike, not at Harper. He was glaring right into my eyes. I quickly looked away, my heart doing a weird flutter. I just kept my mouth shut, convincing myself that it was just some grumpy, elderly relative of hers who had wandered out for a late-night stroll. It was an absolute bullshit rationalization, but when you are in the dark, your brain will feed you any lie to keep you from panicking. I reached the usual drop-off spot. Harper hopped off, gave me a quick hug, and walked away into the darkness toward her house. I sat there for a minute, the engine idling, feeling entirely alone. The silence out there was heavy. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, only broken by the wet, rhythmic croaking of frogs in the mud. I turned the bike around and started the slow drive back out to the main road. I had to pass the tomb again. As the headlight illuminated the area, I saw the old man again. This time, he was not standing still. The dirt path I was driving on was elevated about 3 feet above the actual rice fields, with a steep, grassy slope on either side. There were no stairs leading up from the tomb to the road. The old man was hunched over, struggling to climb up the steep dirt embankment from the lower level of the grave up to the path. I instinctively slowed down. I did not want to hit him if he suddenly stumbled onto the road. I watched him strain, his thin arms reaching up to grab the edge of the dirt. He pulled himself up halfway, but then his grip slipped. I watched his hands give out, and his entire body tipped backward. He fell hard, tumbling backward down the slope into the dark area near the tomb. Panic flared in my chest. I slammed on the brakes, kicked down the stand, and left the engine running. The headlight was pointing straight ahead, so the side of the road where he fell was bathed in thick shadows. I rushed over to the edge and scrambled halfway down the slick dirt bank. I could barely see him, just a pale shape in the dark. I reached out and grabbed his arm to haul him up. The moment my fingers closed around his wrist, my breath caught in my throat. Holy shit, the feeling of his skin is something I will never ever forget. It was entirely wrong. It was not just cold like he had been outside for a while. It was freezing, holding a deep, radiating chill that felt like touching a block of ice left in a freezer. And his arm was completely rigid. There was no give to his muscles, no pulse, just a stiff, unyielding hardness, like a piece of petrified wood. My stomach dropped, but the adrenaline was making me act on autopilot. I practically dragged him up onto the flat surface of the path, completely scraping up my hands and getting my legs covered in this thick, wet mud in the process. Standing right in front of him, he looked like a completely normal, fragile old man, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I swallowed hard and frantically asked him if he was hurt or if he had broken anything. He did not look shaken at all. He just stared at me with those intense eyes and said, "I am fine. Where are you going?" His voice was dry and hollow. I nervously babbled out my whole situation. I told him I was just dropping off my girlfriend, and like a total idiot, I blurted out Harper's full name and even the names of her parents, trying to prove I had a legitimate reason for being there. The old man slowly nodded his head. He looked out toward the dark fields and said, "The people in that house are very difficult. If you want something, let me speak for you." I was so caught off guard by that. I remember feeling this bizarre surge of hope, totally ignoring the freezing cold arm I had just touched. I eagerly asked him if he knew the family well. He looked back at me and said, "When I speak, they all listen." I was practically buzzing. I asked him where he lived so I could come visit him another day and take him up on his offer to talk to Harper's parents for me. He just gave me this long, unreadable look and said, "We will meet again if it is meant to be." Then, he turned around and started shuffling back toward the edge of the embankment, right above the dark tomb. I was honestly so incredibly frustrated. I had just busted my ass, scraping my skin and getting completely covered in mud to haul him up, and now he was just going right back down into the ditch. I took a step forward, protesting, offering to give him a ride home so he would not have to walk in the dark. He stopped at the absolute edge of the drop-off. He raised one stiff, pale finger, pointed down at the massive concrete tomb shrouded in darkness, and said, "No, my house is right here, right here." Before I could even process what he was saying, he simply stepped backward. He let gravity take him, dropping backward off the edge into the pitch-black void of the paddy. I lunged forward to grab him, but there was nothing there. I stared down into the darkness, expecting to hear a splash or a thud or a groan of pain, but there was absolute, suffocating silence. He was completely gone. The shadows had just swallowed him whole. My brain completely short-circuited. The freezing stiffness of his arm, the bizarre conversation, the pointing at the grave. Every single puzzle piece slammed together in my head in a split second. A primal, uncontrollable terror exploded in my chest. "Fucking ghost," I stammered out loud, my voice cracking in the empty night. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, tearing up the skin on my palms until I reached my scooter. I practically threw myself onto the seat, twisted the throttle so hard the front wheel lifted, and tore out of there like a complete maniac. I did not look back. I just focused on the tiny beam of light ahead, shivering uncontrollably in the humid night air. When I finally got back to my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed and immediately texted Harper, frantically typing out that I had just seen a ghost on her road and that I was terrified. The next afternoon, I picked her up to go get some coffee. As soon as she sat down, she demanded to know what my crazy text was about. I sat there, my hands still shaking a little, and I spilled everything. I laid it all out for her. I told her about seeing the old man, how he fell, how freezing his arm was, and how he pointed directly at that large concrete tomb and claimed it was his house before vanishing. Harper went completely pale. Her jaw literally dropped. She stared at me in absolute horror and told me that the tomb I was describing was exactly where her great-grandfather was buried. The man whose death anniversary they had just celebrated yesterday. My jaw literally hit the dirt. I was totally tripping out, asking why on earth they buried him way out on the dirt path instead of somewhere proper. She explained the family lore to me. When her great-grandfather was on his deathbed, she was only about 7 years old. He specifically demanded not to be buried behind the main house. He told his children to bury him out on the main dirt path, bordering the rice fields. His logic was that if he was buried near the house, it would be a massive pain in the ass for the grandkids to walk out to his grave in the middle of the night to light incense. But if he was buried right on the only road leading into the family compound, his grandchildren could easily stop and plant a stick of incense at his grave any time of day or night as they passed by. Hearing that made all the blood drain from my face. I had literally pulled the ghost of her great-grandfather out of a ditch. But then I started thinking about it. He had not tried to hurt me. He did not choke me or chase me. In fact, I had helped him up. And more importantly, the chilling words he spoke echoed in my head. "Let me speak for you." A few days later, I made a decision that felt absolutely insane. I did not tell Harper. I went to the local market and spent a few $100,000, maybe 15 or 20 bucks, on a really nice basket of fresh fruit, some expensive cookies, and incense. For a broke guy back then, it was a solid investment. The funny thing is, I never even lit incense at my own family altar at home, but here I was, doing it to impress a ghost. I drove out to the dirt path in the middle of the day. I parked my bike, climbed down the bank, and laid the offerings out on the cold concrete of the tomb. I lit the incense, pressed my hands together, and awkwardly whispered into the wind. I told him I knew who he was now. I asked him to please visit his family in their dreams and convince them to accept me. It was a total shot in the dark. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Harper. She sounded completely bewildered. She told me that her mom wanted me to come over to the house that afternoon. I could not believe it. I asked her how her mom even knew I existed. Harper said her aunt had supposedly seen me dropping her off one night and snitched to her mom. And now her mom was demanding to look at my face while her dad was out drinking. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was terrifyingly fast. I had just prayed to the grave 3 days ago. I rushed over there with another gift basket. I sat in their living room, sweating profusely, answering a relentless barrage of interrogation questions from her mother about my family background and my job. When I finished, her mother flat out refused to take the gift basket. She coldly told me that I was only allowed to be a distant friend, that her daughter was strictly focused on studying, and warned me that if her husband found out I was trying to date Harper, he would violently destroy me. She kicked me out. I felt defeated, but I had managed to get inside the house. I took the rejected gift basket, drove straight to the tomb, and laid it out for the great-grandfather. I thanked him for getting me in the door and begged him to keep pushing. About a week later, Harper texted me in an absolute panic. Her dad had found out. He was furious, screaming at her all morning, and he demanded that I come over immediately to face him. I drove over feeling like I was walking to my own execution. Her dad was terrifying. He yelled at me, threatened to send me to prison if I messed up his daughter's life, and interrogated me for an hour. But then, right at the end of his rant, he begrudgingly admitted that if we were going to hang out, I had to do it properly. He specifically yelled at me for dropping her off 50 yards away in the dark, saying it was dangerous and unmanly, and ordered me to drop her off right at the front gate from now on. It was a massive victory. I was officially allowed to be seen with her. From that point on, I made it a strict habit. Every few days, I would stop by the tomb. I would clear away the weeds, wipe down the concrete, and light a stick of incense. I kept a running conversation with the dead old man, thanking him and begging for a promotion from sketchy guy to official boyfriend, treating him like my supernatural wingman. A couple of months later, Harper's dad actually invited me over for some beers. We got completely wasted, and drunk out of his mind, he slung his arm around my shoulder. Back then, relationships had this super strict hierarchy you had to climb. You started off as just a casual friend. Then if you were lucky, you got bumped up to being treated like a close nephew by the parents. And only after that could you be considered the official boyfriend. He called me his nephew and told me he was glad I was a decent guy. The boundary was officially broken. We were an acknowledged couple. We dated for about 3 years after that. It was not perfect. We fought a lot. One time we had a massive blowout argument and officially broke up. We did not speak for a whole month. During that entire month, I was so bitter that I completely stopped visiting the tomb. I did not light a single stick of incense. Then, one night, I had a dream. It was incredibly vivid. I was standing on that dirt path. The great-grandfather was standing a few yards away, wearing the same white shirt, but he was not looking at me kindly. He had his hands clasped behind his back, and he was violently shaking his head in deep disappointment. He pointed a stiff finger at me and yelled, telling me that he had moved heaven and earth to help me get his great-granddaughter, and I was throwing it all away over a stupid argument. He yelled that I was ungrateful for abandoning his grave and that he was done helping me. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling incredibly guilty. Even though Harper and I were broken up, I felt like I owed the old man my respect. So, I checked my watch. It was a random Tuesday morning. I decided to drive out there around 11:17 a.m. to apologize and light some incense. When I pulled up to the grave, I froze. Harper was already standing there. She turned around and looked at me in shock. She asked me what the hell I was doing at her great-grandfather's grave. I awkwardly confessed that he had visited me in a dream last night and yelled at me, so I came to apologize. Harper's eyes widened. Her voice trembled as she told me that she had the exact same dream. She said the old man had appeared in her bedroom, screaming at her for being stubborn, and aggressively commanded her to go to his grave at exactly 11 a.m. that morning. The craziest part was, she told me she had never, ever dreamed of her great-grandfather since the day he died, until that very night, standing there by the concrete tomb, realizing we had both been bullied by a ghost into showing up at the same time. All our anger just evaporated. We talked, we went to get lunch, and we got back together. Fast forward a bit and we were officially engaged. About a month before the wedding, I was sitting at her family compound, drinking tea with a bunch of her relatives. One of her uncles looked at me, shook his head, and asked how on earth I had managed to crack her strict parents. I chuckled and decided to tell them the whole truth. I recounted the story of helping the old man on the dirt road, the freezing arm, and the years of bribing the great-grandfather with incense. Her uncle slapped his knee so hard it echoed in the room. He looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, and said that Harper probably did not even know the full story. He leaned in and told us that when Harper was just a tiny 5-year-old girl, the adults used to tease her about who she would marry. The great-grandfather, who was still alive and very old at the time, got fiercely protective. He stood up in front of the whole family and made a solemn vow. He swore that when Harper grew up, anyone who wanted to marry her would have to step over his dead body first. Her uncle told us that when the old man said that, all the adults in the room actually burst out laughing. They mocked him, joking like, "Come on, old man, by the time she is old enough to get married, you are going to be over 100 years old. That is way too difficult." But he was dead serious. He explicitly stated that if he did not like the suitor, he would personally take a broom and sweep them out of the driveway. But if he approved of the man, he swore he would personally take him by the hand and lead him right to the front door. He declared that he alone would choose Harper's husband, and her parents would have absolutely no say in the matter. When her uncle dropped that bomb about the great-grandfather's vow, that he would personally filter out her suitors and physically guide the right one in, it felt like all the air just got sucked out of the room. Every single time I drove past that grave in the dark, he had been watching me, testing me, pulling the strings, like I was just a pawn on his chessboard. We went straight out to that dirt mound, tears absolutely streaming down our faces, to light some incense and thank him. It's a heavy thing to swallow, realizing your entire family, your kid, your whole life, was quite literally hand-picked by a dead man. You know that saying about getting what you pay for? Well, my parents learned that the hard way when they bought our house in Binchan about 20 years ago. It was dirt cheap, because the entire area was practically a ghost town filled with scattered burial plots, but we couldn't even see the graveyard behind our lot due to how high and tight the back wall was built. The people who owned it before us tried to maximize their square footage by building right up to the absolute limit, essentially using a grave as a foundation. We spent years in that house, all 4 of us jammed into a single bedroom, completely unaware that we were basically sharing our living space with a cemetery. To give you some context on how cramped things were, it was my dad, my mom, my older brother Lawson, and me, all sleeping on mats on the floor of this one tiny room. The house itself was basically a long concrete tube. You walked in through the front door into a small living area, followed by the single bedroom, then a tiny kitchen, and finally, right at the very back, there was this open-air courtyard. We called it the drying yard. It was a sunken rectangular space, maybe 10 feet deep, where my parents kept the toilet, a makeshift shower area, and a spot to hang wet clothes. The very back of this courtyard was a massive, solid concrete wall painted a dull, dirty white. And that back wall was where everything started to get really, really weird. Vietnam is hot, like suffocatingly intensely hot for most of the year. During the dry season, the sun would beat down on that back courtyard all day long, turning the concrete into an absolute oven. If you touched any part of the side walls, The heat would practically burn your hand. But the back wall, specifically this one rectangular section right in the middle, starting from the ground and going up about 3 feet, was always freezing cold. I don't mean just a little cool in the shade. I mean it felt like touching the inside of a meat freezer. My dad used to go out there at night to smoke, and he would lean his bare back against that specific patch of concrete just to cool down. He always thought it was just some weird architectural quirk or a draft from underground. Then the rainy season hit. The rest of the courtyard would get wet and dry off naturally, but that one freezing rectangular patch on the wall started growing this thick, dark green moss. It was constantly damp, like water was actively weeping out from inside the concrete itself. It looked like a dark, bruised sore on the white wall. We lived with that weird wall for a few years before my dad finally figured out what was causing it. Our overhead water tank got clogged one weekend, so my dad dragged this tall, rickety wooden ladder out to the back courtyard to check the pipes. When he climbed up to the top of the wall, he naturally looked over the edge into the empty lot behind our house. He told me years later that his stomach immediately dropped. It wasn't just an empty dirt lot. It was a cluster of 5 or 6 forgotten, overgrown graves. And the absolute worst part was that one of those graves, a very old one with a completely blank, weathered headstone, was pressed flush against our back wall. In real estate over here, there is this incredibly greedy mindset where people will steal every single millimeter of land they can get away with. Even back then, just a single square meter of land was worth millions of dong, maybe 50 or $100, which doesn't sound like much, but to working class folks like us, every inch was an absolute fortune. So whoever originally built our house didn't just build near the property line. They built right over it, slapping the concrete wall so tightly against that existing grave that the tomb was practically acting as a structural support. That freezing, weeping rectangle of moss in our courtyard was the exact shape and size of the casket resting just a few inches away on the other side of the bricks. My dad kept this a total secret from my mom. He didn't want to freak her out, especially since we couldn't afford to move anyway. But things started escalating. Since we didn't have a washing machine, my mom washed all our clothes by hand and hung them on a low wire line right in front of that back wall. Every now and then, she would go out in the afternoon to collect the dry laundry, and a few pieces would be missing. We usually found them on the wet concrete floor, which was annoying but normal. However, after my dad discovered the grave, the laundry stopped falling to the floor. Instead, my mom started finding her clothes, specifically her undergarments, flung upwards. Our back wall was almost 9 feet tall, and to keep thieves out, my dad had smashed a bunch of empty glass soy sauce bottles and embedded the jagged glass shards right into the wet cement at the very top of the wall. My mom would find her clothes tangled and violently ripped to shreds on those glass spikes 9 feet in the air. Gravity doesn't work like that. Wind in a sunken, walled-in courtyard doesn't blow straight up with enough force to impale heavy, wet fabric onto broken glass. My mom was so frustrated, complaining to my dad about having to constantly stitch up torn clothes because we were too broke to buy new ones. My dad quietly realized that hanging dirty clothes right over someone's final resting place was probably a massive sign of disrespect. He snuck out of the house, walked the long way around the block to get into the empty lot, and lit a bundle of incense at the blank headstone, silently begging the spirit to leave his wife alone. He then told my mom to just start hanging the clothes on the opposite side of the yard. Surprisingly, it worked. The clothes stopped flying up. A few months went by, and right after the Lunar New Year, like any family living in a tiny house, we started hoarding stuff. Old cardboard boxes, broken fans, things we thought we could fix later. My mom dragged an old wooden shelving unit into the courtyard and pushed it right up against that freezing, mossy section of the back wall to store all our junk. Among the clutter was this heavy, broken Toshiba rice cooker from the early 2000s. Then, the noises started. We would all be sleeping in the front room, and maybe past 2 a.m. or something, we would hear this distinct clattering sound from the backyard. stuff falling off the shelves, tin pots hitting the concrete. My parents always just blamed the stray cats or the fact that the shelf was overloaded, and they would just pick it all up the next morning. But one night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I was a little kid, rubbing my eyes, dragging my feet through the dark kitchen to get to the back courtyard. The second I stepped out into the humid night air, I heard this slow, heavy scraping noise blending with a loud metallic clattering that just kept grinding against the rough concrete without stopping. I froze. I looked over at the junk shelf. The lid of that old Toshiba rice cooker had fallen off, and the actual heavy metal cooker itself was on the ground, and it was rolling. It wasn't just wobbling on an uneven floor. It was rolling with purpose, grinding against the rough concrete, heading straight toward me from about 20 feet away. I was completely paralyzed. I just stood there in the dark, watching this inanimate object slowly, methodically make its way across the yard until it bumped right into my bare toes with a dull thud. I completely lost my mind. I was so terrified that I literally peed my pants right there on the spot, screaming for my mom at the top of my fucking lungs. My mom came rushing out, looking incredibly annoyed, completely ignoring my absolute panic, and just yelling at me for wetting my pajamas. I was crying, frantically pointing at the rice cooker, trying to explain that the heavy metal pot had rolled across the entire yard to hit my foot. She just rolled her eyes, told me it probably just fell off the shelf and bounced, grabbed some dry clothes off the wire line, and told me to get into the bathroom so she could clean me up. While I was standing in the bathroom shivering, my mom was crouched down rinsing out my clothes, and the courtyard was dead silent again. Then, I heard the scraping noise. I peeked out the bathroom door, and my heart completely stopped. That same rice cooker was now rolling over the raised concrete lip of the doorway and moving directly into the house. It rolled a few feet inside, slowly came to a complete stop, and then just tipped over backward onto its spine, lying there like a dead bug. I screamed again. My mom finally looked up, saw the cooker in the middle of the kitchen, and still somehow rationalized it. She just sighed, picked the damn thing up, carried it back out, and this time she shoved it firmly against the wall on the floor. The stuff kept falling off the shelves for another month, until my dad finally got fed up, quietly went outside to light more incense, and then cleared the entire shelf away. He knew the entity behind the wall hated having our garbage pressed against its face. After he cleared the area, we actually had about 2 years of total peace. By this point, my brother Lawson was about 15 years old, stepping right into his moody teenage phase, and the absolute last thing he wanted was to share a single floor mat with his parents and his annoying little brother. He demanded his own room. Since our house was incredibly small, my dad came up with a cheap solution to close off that back courtyard. He just built a simple brick wall to enclose the front, slapped a single door on it, used that massive, mossy back wall as the rear, and threw a corrugated tin roof over the top of the whole thing. Lawson's new bedroom was essentially a hot, suffocating windowless concrete box with a tin roof baking in the sun. To make it look a little nicer, my dad bought some cheap Korean wallpaper and glued it over the concrete. But within 3 days, the wallpaper covering that specific freezing rectangular patch completely bubbled up and peeled right off, revealing the damp, weeping concrete underneath. My dad tried gluing it back up 3 different times, but it kept sloughing off like dead skin. Eventually, he got frustrated and just shoved a low wooden dresser against the wall to hide the ugly spot right next to Lawson's bed. For the first week, Lawson loved his new privacy. Then, the night harassment started. You have to understand that in our family, I took after my mom, but Lawson was exactly like my dad. He was stubborn, and whenever he had a problem, he would try to handle it himself instead of snitching to our parents. One morning, my dad was giving us a ride to school, and Lawson just kept glaring at me from the back seat. When we got off the bike, he violently smacked the back of my head, calling me a little creep and demanding an apology. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. He told me that I had sneaked into his room in the middle of the night, crawled into his bed, hugged him tight from behind, and then ran away before he could turn around. I swore up and down that I didn't do it, but he just thought I was lying to get away with a prank. This happened 3 days in a row. Every morning, Lawson would be more pissed off, complaining that I was sneaking into his locked room and hugging him with freezing cold arms. By the 5th night, Lawson completely snapped. Around maybe past 2 a.m., he stormed into my parents' room, flipped on the lights, and started yelling at them to control me. He said I was constantly hugging his back and tickling him, and it was ruining his sleep right before his big high school entrance exams. My parents sat up, groggy and annoyed, and started yelling at me. I was sobbing defensively, sitting on my mat, telling them that I had been asleep in their room the entire night. Lawson looked confused. He described exactly what happened. He said he was sleeping facing away from the wall, leaving about a 2-foot gap between his back and the peeling concrete. He said he felt 2 freezing cold arms wrap rigidly around his torso, pinning his arms to his sides so tightly he couldn't even breathe. He lay there paralyzed for about 3 minutes before he finally found the strength to violently twist around. He told my parents that the room was pitch black, but he saw a solid, human-shaped shadow scramble off the bed, sprint toward the door, and just vanish. When he realized I had been with my parents the whole time, the color completely drained from Lawson's face. My parents told him to just go back to sleep and stop imagining things. But Lawson didn't complain about me anymore after that. Instead, he just started rotting away, his personality completely inverted. He went from being this caring, somewhat irritable older brother to a completely hollow shell. He stopped eating. He failed every single one of his high school placement exams, which meant he had to enroll in a really expensive private school, causing my parents to yell at him constantly. He spent his entire summer vacation locked inside that suffocating windowless tin box. He stopped taking showers. His hair was a greasy, matted mess, and his skin took on this sickly, translucent grayish tint. My mom felt guilty about yelling at him, so she would often make snacks and bring them to his room to try and cheer him up. One afternoon, she brought him a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice with ice. She opened his door very quietly so she wouldn't disturb him. The overhead fluorescent tube was buzzing, lighting up the room brightly. Lawson was sitting at his desk, which was pushed right up against the back wall. He wasn't reading or playing games. He was just resting his chin on his hands, staring blankly, directly into the concrete wall. He was completely unresponsive. My mom quietly set the cold glass of juice on the desk right next to his hand, told him to drink it so he wouldn't get sick, and walked out. 30 minutes later, Lawson walked into the kitchen holding the glass. He looked confused and asked my mom when she had brought the juice in, claiming he had no memory of her entering his room. But more importantly, he complained that the juice was completely spoiled. My mom didn't believe him. She had just squeezed those oranges half an hour ago. But when she took the glass and took a tiny sip, she immediately spat it out in the sink. The juice tasted putrid, sour, and carried this heavy, foul odor, like it had been sitting out in the hot sun for a week. Over here, we believe that when spirits consume the essence of food or drink, it instantly turns foul and loses all its nutritional value, leaving behind a husk of rotting flavor. This happened over a dozen times. My mom would bring him fresh steamed buns or sweet soup. He would stare blankly at the wall for an hour, and then the food would inexplicably turn sour and rotten. Things got so much worse when we started hearing the whispers. Lawson's room shared a thin partition with the bathroom. Whenever I went to brush my teeth, I could hear a low, rhythmic murmuring coming from his side. My mom had already confiscated his phone as punishment for failing his exams, so there was absolutely no way he was talking to a friend. My mom thought he had stolen her phone or bought a burner, so she quietly unlatched his door and peeked in. He was sitting on his bed, facing the wall, smiling and having a full, quiet conversation with the concrete. When my mom barged in, he violently flinched, looked incredibly guilty, and just threw the blanket over his head, refusing to speak to her. But the thing that completely broke my parents happened a few weeks later. My dad had taken me out to run errands, so it was just my mom and Lawson at home. My mom was cooking lunch in the kitchen when she heard footsteps. She turned around and saw Lawson standing in the doorway. He hadn't voluntarily left his room in weeks. He just stood there, awkwardly rubbing his hands together, shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking down at the floor like he was terrified to ask a question. My mom told him lunch would be ready soon and asked what he wanted. Lawson finally looked up, his eyes completely dead, and told her that he wanted to get married. My mom almost dropped her spatula. She thought he was making a sick joke. He was 15 years old, unemployed, and had just failed middle school. She started scolding him, telling him she wouldn't even let him have a girlfriend right now, let alone a wife, and told him to stop speaking nonsense. But Lawson just kept desperately begging, telling her that he was serious and that his wife was waiting for her in his bedroom right now. My mom's stomach absolutely dropped. She assumed some crazy teenage girl from his school had sneaked into the house while she wasn't looking and was hiding in his room. Furious, my mom marched past him, demanding he show her this girl. She walked over to his tin box room and threw the door open. It was the middle of the afternoon, but the room was completely pitch black. My mom reached out to flick on the overhead fluorescent light, but Lawson suddenly grabbed her wrist with this terrifying, unnatural strength, frantically whispering that she couldn't turn the lights on because his wife was afraid of the bright light. My mom was starting to panic, realizing there was no girl in the room. She stood in the doorway, staring into the dark, trying to process if her son had completely lost his mind from the academic pressure. Then, Lawson did the most horrifying thing I have ever heard of. He let go of her wrist, walked over to his desk, pulled the chair back, and got down on his hands and knees. He crawled completely under the desk, pressing his face right into the small gap where the floor met the concrete wall. There was absolutely nothing under there except a tiny plastic trash can, but Lawson crouched in the dark, his voice totally completely changing tone, becoming this soft, sickeningly sweet whisper, telling his wife that his mother was here and coaxing whatever the fuck was down there to come out and introduce herself. My mom completely broke. She grabbed Lawson by the collar of his filthy shirt, screaming her lungs out, and violently dragged him out of the room, slamming the door shut. She dragged him into the front living room, but he just sat on the floor, his head lolling loosely on his neck, rocking back and forth, crying and muttering over and over that he didn't want to go to school anymore, and that if they didn't let him marry her, he was gonna die. He wasn't talking like a whiny teenager at all. His voice was completely flat and heavy, sounding exactly like a grown adult making a dead serious threat. My mom called my dad in hysterics. When my dad rushed home and saw Lawson sitting on the floor, blankly staring at the tiles and repeating that he was going to die if he couldn't be with his wife, the realization hit my dad like a physical punch to the gut. He finally confessed to my mom about the grave behind the wall. He realized that the dead person buried on the other side of those bricks was a young woman, a young, lonely girl who had died decades ago, completely forgotten, with no family to burn incense or offer her comfort. And my parents had essentially locked their teenage son in a windowless box, making him sleep with his back pressed directly against her tombstone every single night for months. They had unknowingly forced a spiritual bond, an unnatural attachment formed by sleeping mere inches from a lonely, restless spirit. They immediately pulled Lawson out of that room and called in an expert, a guy who dealt with severe spiritual attachments. When the guy inspected the back wall and the property line, he looked grim. He told my parents that the spirit was incredibly old and far too entrenched in that specific spot to be forcefully banished or exorcised. She had claimed that space long before our house was ever built. The guy explicitly said that performing a ritual to cut the spiritual tie right now would be completely useless because the grave was still physically touching our house. The only solution was physical separation. They eventually tore down the back room, built a new wall a few feet in, and planted some mulberry trees. To make sure Lawson was as far away from that spot as possible, my dad built him this makeshift room up in the loft, out of cheap aluminum framing and glass panels, strictly forbidding him from ever sleeping in the back again. After that, the whole thing just somehow stopped, and my brother eventually snapped out of it and grew up completely normal. But I'm sharing this anonymously because the guy who helped us warned my parents that we could never, ever remind Lawson of what happened, or that thing would come back infinitely worse. And honestly, I still stay up at night staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell would happen if he somehow stumbled across this exact story online. Like, what if just hearing these details is enough to trigger that connection again and invite her right back into his head? I didn't actually see this happen. I was just a toddler, maybe 2 or 3 years old. But my parents and grandparents have retold it so many times it feels like a memory branded into my brain. This was over 20 years ago, back in my old neighborhood in Thao Dien, and it is all about this extremely wealthy old lady. Her husband used to be this highly corrupt politician who hoarded a massive fortune before getting busted and mysteriously dropping dead in prison just a few months later. Nobody ever found out if he was secretly taken out or poisoned by someone. The story just kind of leaves that part completely in the dark. But he was cunning enough to launder the real money through his wife's relatives, leaving her sitting on an absolute goldmine while the authorities only seized a few surface-level assets. They only managed to confiscate this one tiny house, maybe a single car, and a random plot of farmland. The guy played it off like that was his entire life savings, but everyone in the area knew it was just the tip of a very screwed-up iceberg. Once he passed away in a prison cell, his wife just quietly went around picking up all the hidden properties and cash that were legally under her extended family members' names. It was a staggering amount of money, easily worth millions of dollars in today's economy, and she did not just sit around spending it on useless garbage. She was actually incredibly shrewd with her finances. She had about 5 or 6 kids, I cannot remember the exact number, but she basically bankrolled all of them to go to the city and get top-tier educations. She turned them into doctors, engineers, nurses, and the ones who were not great at studying got enough capital to open massive wholesale businesses in the local markets. But there was this one son who did not care about books or normal jobs. He went straight into the underground scene. His mother literally funded his start as a loan shark and a local mob enforcer. So, you have to picture this family's influence. They had connections to high society intellectuals, government officials left over from her husband's network, and literal gangsters roaming the streets. My grandparents used to tell me that back when her husband was still alive and actively stealing money, this woman was the sweetest, most soft-spoken person you could ever meet. She kept her head down, acting like a humble housewife, mostly because they were terrified that if she flaunted her wealth, people would get suspicious and the cops would start digging. But the second the money was fully washed and her husband was dead, her entire personality completely flipped. Once she realized nobody could touch her cash anymore, she turned into an absolute nightmare of a human being. She became unbelievably arrogant, walking around the neighborhood like she owned the very dirt we walked on. She would scream at people, throwing these incredibly deep, venomous insults at anyone who had less money than her, which was basically everyone. She even cursed out my grandparents a few times over absolutely nothing. If she went to the market and someone bumped into her, she would just stand there and scream her head off. There was this one time a neighbor's dog wandered over and left a pile of crap in her front yard. Most people would just be annoyed and hose it away, but she stood outside her gate and screamed insults at the neighbor's house for 3 or 4 days straight. She did not stop complaining and yelling until the neighbor actually had to take the dog and give it away to someone in another town just so she would never see it again. That was the kind of petty, toxic energy she carried around. So, jump forward to around the year 1999 or maybe 2001. My parents are a bit fuzzy on the exact timeline, but this old lady suddenly fell violently ill. It was completely unexpected. She was bedridden for a few days, and then she just died. Her family threw this massive, incredibly expensive funeral. Hundreds of people showed up, mostly because of her kids' connections, but a lot of the guests noticed something really off when they went up to pay their respects to the body. Normally, when you touch someone who has passed away, their skin is freezing cold and stiff. But everyone who brushed her hand or looked closely at her face noticed that her skin was surprisingly soft, almost warm, and she had this healthy pinkish color to her cheeks. If you did not look at her chest to see that she wasn't breathing, you would swear she was just taking a nap. People started whispering that she must have had some crazy good karma for her body to stay so perfectly preserved like that, which is kind of hilarious considering how vile she was to everyone. Now, I need to mention something about her jewelry, because it is the main reason things went completely off the rails. A few years before she died, she started wearing a ridiculous amount of solid gold. It was not stuff she bought at a fancy store. It all came from her gangster son, the loan shark. When desperate people pawned their cars, house deeds, or family heirlooms to him and missed their payments, he would just keep their gold and give it to his mother. Because it was all collected from random victims, none of it matched. She would wear this chunky ring on one finger, a totally different styled bracelet on her wrist, 2 or 3 completely mismatched thick gold chains around her neck, and heavy earrings. It was a bizarre, chaotic display of wealth. When they were preparing her body for the burial, everyone assumed the family would take the jewelry off, but her youngest daughter, who was maybe in her early 30s and totally devoted to her mother, made this insane decision. She announced right in the middle of the crowded funeral that they were going to bury their mother with all the gold still on her body. We are talking about several thick bars worth of pure gold, which would easily be worth well over 50 or 60,000 bucks today. People tried to talk her out of it, suggesting they just keep the jewelry in a safe as family heirlooms since they were already rich. But the daughter stubbornly refused. She wanted her mother to have it all in the afterlife. Of course, when you announce to a neighborhood full of struggling people that you are burying a small fortune in the dirt, someone is going to get greedy. People were openly whispering at the funeral, muttering about how nice it would be to just drop dead and be buried with that much cash. Naturally, some sketchy guys in the crowd hatched a plan to rob the grave. I do not know exactly how many guys were involved or who the mastermind was, but the events that followed are just permanently burned into local history. They buried her in this private family mausoleum right in the backyard of their massive modern villa. Her husband was already buried back there. For the first couple of days after the funeral, the family was always out by the grave, cleaning it, burning incense, just hanging around. But after about a week, things settled down, and the grave was mostly left alone at night. So it is about a week after the burial, maybe around 2 a.m. or something. The exact time is blurry, but it was dead quiet. The family had hired hands and groundskeepers who usually slept on these fold-out cots near the front gate of the property to keep watch. Out of nowhere, the workers were jolted awake by a motorcycle idling loudly in the dark. They heard this young guy's voice, sounding like he was somewhere under 30 years old, echoing from the street, desperately yelling at them to run to the backyard right now because the old lady had come back to life. The workers were super annoyed, thinking it was just some drunk kids playing a sick prank, because nobody ever messed with that family, and the woman was buried under several feet of packed dirt. But then another voice from the dark street started rushing the first guy, telling him to hurry up and drive away before they got beat up. The workers scrambled out of their cots and opened the front gate, only catching a glimpse of 2 guys in completely black clothes wearing huge face masks. One guy hopped on the back of a beat-up motorcycle, and they sped off into the night without any helmets on. It was incredibly obvious they were thieves. The workers stood there in the humid night air, completely confused. They debated whether they should even wake up the family. The kids were sleeping in their air-conditioned rooms inside the massive villa, still grieving, and the workers did not want to risk getting fired for waking them up over a stupid prank. Eventually, they decided to just bite the bullet. They went inside and nervously told the eldest son about the 2 guys on the bike screaming about his dead mother. The eldest son absolutely lost it. He screamed at the workers for being idiots, demanding to know why they were entertaining such a sick joke when the cement on his mother's grave had barely even dried. He basically told them to go back to sleep and stop bothering him. Nobody bothered to walk to the backyard to check on the grave. They just assumed it was the neighbors messing with them, because the old lady used to treat everyone like dirt. So the workers went back out to the front yard, their ears ringing from getting yelled at, and they laid back down on their cots. They tried to go to sleep, but maybe 15 or 20 minutes later, this noise started bleeding into the quiet night. It was this awful, muffled groaning sound. It was not a normal human cry. It was more like this nasal, vibrating hum, like someone trying to scream while suffocating on a mouthful of mud. and the sound just kept pulsing rhythmically through the thick air. The workers felt the blood drain from their faces. They grabbed their flashlights and started slowly creeping around the side of the massive villa, following that horrible humming noise toward the family mausoleum in the backyard. When their flashlight beams hit the grave, they nearly lost their minds. The fresh concrete had been completely smashed to pieces. The heavy stone headstone was knocked over into the dirt. The brand new grave was dug completely open, exposing the expensive wooden casket at the bottom of the pit. The thick lid of the casket was pried up, propped open with a thick bamboo stick. The workers were absolutely terrified and went sprinting back to the house, screaming for the sons and daughters to wake up, because the grave had been destroyed. The whole family came rushing out of the villa carrying heavy machetes and metal pipes, fully expecting to find grave robbers stealing the gold. When they got to the edge of the ruined grave, they saw a black plastic garbage bag sitting right on the edge of the dirt pile. Someone grabbed it and ripped it open, and every single piece of the old lady's gold was sitting right there. The thieves had successfully gathered all the jewelry, put it in the bag, but something must have completely terrified them, because they just abandoned a massive fortune and ran for their lives. At this point, that awful humming sound had completely stopped. The backyard was dead silent. The family stood at the edge of the pit, looking down into the open casket. The old lady was just laying there in the shadows, perfectly still, looking exactly like a corpse again. They started talking nervously among themselves, planning to call the cops in the morning to hunt down the thieves, totally ignoring the body. But then the youngest daughter, the one who insisted on burying the gold, was staring intensely down at her mother's face. The body looked grayish and slightly shriveled after being in the ground for a week, and nobody else really wanted to look at it. But the daughter suddenly interrupted everyone, her voice shaking, asking them why her mother's eyelids were moving. When you close your eyes and dart your pupils around in a panic, it makes the thin skin of your eyelids flutter, and that is exactly what the daughter was seeing. The older siblings immediately told her to shut up, accusing her of being disrespectful and warning her that their mother's spirit would punish her for talking nonsense. But the youngest daughter refused to back down, desperately pointing into the dark pit and begging them to just look closely at the face. The eldest son finally shined his flashlight directly onto the corpse's face, and everyone completely froze. The old lady was absolutely exhausted and physically ruined, but she was definitely alive. Her breathing was so shallow it was almost invisible, but her lips were barely twitching, just making these tiny pathetic movements in the light. Holy shit. They all just lost their minds. They started screaming that she was alive, completely abandoning the gold. They grabbed some heavy ropes, jumped into the ruined grave, looped the ropes around the heavy wooden casket, and managed to haul the entire thing out of the hole. They shoved her into the back of their expensive car and sped off to the nearest emergency room. When they hauled her into the hospital, the morgue staff and ER nurses were incredibly confused. Morgue workers who are around bodies all day know exactly what a week-old corpse looks like. They were looking at this grayish, dirty woman and asking the family why on earth they dug up a dead body and brought it to the ER. The family was screaming and crying, swearing that she was just breathing a minute ago. The doctors had to use a stethoscope and hook her up to an EKG machine just to find a heartbeat because she looked so physically dead. But the machine beeped. She was alive, just hanging on by the absolute thinnest thread possible. They hooked her up to IV fluids, put her on a ventilator, and somehow, her body started fighting back. She was in the hospital for about a solid month. During the first few days after she woke up, her brain was completely fried. She acted like a newborn baby, screaming at the lights, totally terrified of the nurses, and she had no idea who her own kids were. It took days of the family sitting by her bed, showing her old family photo albums and wedding pictures, before her memories slowly started clicking back into place. After a month, she was breathing normally on her own, and they finally brought her back to the villa. For the first week back home, she was surprisingly quiet and completely zoned out. She barely recognized the neighbors who came to visit. But as her strength returned, that vicious personality came rushing back. and she finally started talking about what happened to her in the dark. She started cursing and swearing constantly, telling everyone that she had been dragged away by these two entities from the underworld. She described them as these towering figures, basically the Grim Reapers, who had completely screwed up their paperwork. They were supposed to collect the soul of another woman who had the exact same first and last name and was born on the exact same day, month, and year as her. She claimed these Reapers dragged her down into this dark, agonizing space for a couple of days before they realized they massively screwed up the paperwork. But by the time they brought her soul back up to the surface, her family had already buried her under almost 10 feet of solid dirt. She said the Reapers were terrified of getting punished by the Lord of the Underworld for messing up, so they forced her soul back into her rotting body and promised her that they would manipulate two local thugs into digging her up in exactly 2 or 3 days. She told her kids about the absolute, suffocating torture of lying awake inside that dark wooden box, breathing in the stale air, feeling insects crawling around her, and passing out over and over again from the lack of oxygen. She said she was right on the edge of just giving up and dying for real when she finally heard the heavy thuds of shovels hitting the dirt above her. She said she was so weak she could not even speak. When the thieves finally popped the lid open, she just managed to let out a few weak groans before passing out again. That tiny noise was enough to scare the thieves so badly they dropped the gold and ran. But because the Reapers were apparently controlling the situation, the thieves felt this unnatural urge to run to the front gate and alert the family instead of just fleeing into the night. You would think surviving, that would make her grateful. But no, she was absolutely furious. She spent her days screaming at the ceiling, cursing out the spirits and the gods for being so incredibly incompetent. She kept bragging that years ago, several high-end fortune tellers had sworn she would live to be 90 years old. She was only 75, and she was loudly complaining to anyone who would listen that the underworld was trying to cheat her out of 15 years, threatening to beat the Reapers to a pulp if she ever saw them again. A few days later, things took a really dark turn. She started waking up in the middle of the night and wandering out to the backyard, standing right near the edge of her own empty grave. She would just stand there in the dark, pointing her finger at the empty air, screaming at these invisible figures to leave her alone. She would yell that they already made a mistake and they needed to back off because she was not the woman they were looking for. She started picking up heavy rocks from the garden and throwing them violently into the dark. When her kids ran out to pull her back inside, she would point toward her husband's tombstone and say that those two Reapers were just hovering there, looking blurry and floating like cheap kites in the wind. She said they just kept whispering her full name, hissing Mwintitu over and over again in the dark, trying to take her back. The family was absolutely terrified. The next morning they bought massive amounts of expensive roasted pork and ducks, setting up a huge offering table in the backyard. They were getting on their knees, begging the Reapers to double-check their ledgers and spare their mother, reminding the empty air that she was supposed to live until she was 90. But it did not work. That night, she was thrashing around in her bed, violently shoving her kids away, screaming that the entities were back in her room. She demanded her kids go find dog blood and dirty laundry to throw at the spirits to chase them away, which is this old local superstition to ward off evil. Her kids were crying, holding her down, totally unable to see whatever terrifying thing was standing in the corner of the room, keeping her awake all night. By the time the sun came up, she was completely hysterical. She absolutely refused to stay in the villa for another second, demanding someone drive her to a friend's house far away to hide from the Reapers. It was chaotic. They had 3 expensive cars in the garage, but the kids were either busy dealing with the fallout or running errands, and the one car left at home had a completely dead battery and would not start. She was complaining that her head was splitting open from hearing her name whispered all night, so she ordered one of the older groundskeepers to just take her on a cheap motorbike. The worker was terrified of her, so he drove incredibly slow, just hugging the side of the road to be safe. They got to this busy intersection, and out of nowhere, a massive cargo truck completely lost control. When you are in a split-second survival situation, instincts just take over. The driver, who was a healthy guy in his 20s, immediately bailed off the bike and rolled out of the way. But there was absolutely no way a frail, sleep-deprived 75-year-old woman could react in time. She just let out a quick gasp before the truck slammed into her, crushed to pieces under the heavy tires. She died instantly on the hot asphalt. When the family called around to deliver the news, the neighbors actually thought it was a scam. They had just paid about 500,000 dong in sympathy money, maybe 30 or 40 bucks, which was a decent chunk of change back then, for her first funeral a month ago, and they were annoyed that they might have to pay again just because she couldn't stay dead. The neighborhood gossip was vicious. Everyone was whispering that the reapers dragged her back down because she was too fucking arrogant, cursing at the spirits who literally set up her rescue from the grave. The family was so pissed at the rumors that they finally brought in a spiritual master who confirmed her second death wasn't some petty revenge from the underworld. It was just her actual scheduled time to go. He laid it all out, saying that the other Nguyen T2, the woman who was supposed to be taken the first time, had actually died about a month prior. Our old lady's fate was only ever meant to outlive that other woman by a little over a month, meaning her lifeline was officially, undeniably up. That whole living to 90 thing? Just fake psychics kissing up to a rich official's wife for extra cash back in the day? The Reapers didn't hold a grudge for her cursing at them. Her name was simply crossed out in Hell's ledger, and they were just clocking in to do their job. After the dust settled, my mom had to drag herself to that exact same house for a second funeral, listening to the neighborhood gossip slowly fade out into this heavy, exhausting silence. I need to tell you about something that happened back in 8th grade, when I was 13 and dealing with some severe cognitive delays. Kids used to call it being dumb, and because I was so slow to catch on, I got picked on relentlessly, to the point where my only defense mechanism was to physically run away whenever someone spooked me. Looking back, that desperate need to be liked is exactly why I let those kids lure me into an old graveyard after school, totally blind to the fact that they were just setting me up. You have to understand what it feels like to live in a brain that constantly feels like it is walking through thick mud. I was not stupid in the sense that I could not learn, because my grades were actually fine, but my processing speed was just horribly delayed. People would say things to me, and it would take a solid minute for the meaning to actually click in my head. I remember teachers getting so incredibly frustrated with me during lessons. They would explain a simple math problem, and the smart kids would get it instantly, while I just sat there staring blankly. The teachers would eventually just sigh heavily and tell me to sit down and stop wasting everyone else's time. It was not just at school either. Even my own extended family treated me like some sort of broken toys. My aunts and uncles would talk over me, or just give me these condescending looks of pity that honestly felt worse than being yelled at. The only people who actually treated me like a normal human being were my parents. They were incredibly patient, but the constant isolation from everyone else outside my house just made my condition worse. It made me a nervous wreck. I was terrified of absolutely everything. A stray cat jumping out of an alley, a loud noise, a spider on the wall. It did not matter what it was. If someone yelled my name to spook me, my brain would just short circuit and my body would take over. I would literally stand up in the middle of a class and sprint out the door without a second thought. I didn't even have a fight response. It was just pure flight. That intense loneliness is a really messed up thing for a kid. You get so starved for any kind of positive attention that you ignore every single red flag staring you in the face. I remember it was a Tuesday, maybe around 4:15 p.m., and school had just let out. This was back in Vietnam during the heavy rainy season, around October or November. The sky was always this bruised purple color, and the air felt thick and heavy with moisture. I was walking home alone, lugging my heavy backpack down the muddy street, just completely lost in my own slow thoughts. I lived only a few blocks from the school, but the walk always felt endless. That is when I heard a group of kids calling out to me. It was about 5 or 6 of them, boys and girls from my grade who usually either ignored me or made fun of me. They were standing near the end of the street, waving me over. My heart actually skipped a beat with excitement. I was so freaking happy that they were acknowledging me that I practically jogged over to them. I wanted them to like me so badly that I did not even stop to wonder why they were suddenly being nice. We chatted for a bit, mostly just them asking me weird random questions, and then one of the older boys asked me if I was scared of anything. I knew I was the biggest coward in the neighborhood, but I really did not want them to laugh at me. I puffed out my chest and told them that I was not scared of a single thing in the world. They started pushing it, asking if I was afraid of ghosts or evil spirits. The mere mention of ghosts made my stomach do flips, but I lied through my teeth and told them that my parents and teachers always said ghosts were not real, so there was absolutely nothing to be afraid of. They seemed really amused by that answer. They told me that if I was so brave, I should come with them to check out a cool spot up ahead. They basically grabbed my arms and pulled me along until we reached the large iron gates of the local cemetery. I had walked past this place 100 times, but I had never actually gone inside. The way cemeteries worked around there was pretty straightforward. If your family had a lot of money, maybe a few $1,000s, you could buy a proper concrete vault deep inside the gated area. The groundskeeper maintained those plots and kept everything clean, but if your family was poor and could not afford a real plot, they would just bury you right outside the main gates on this patch of wild land. Those graves were nothing but shallow mounds of dirt. No tombstones, no pictures, maybe just a cheap incense bowl stuck in the mud if you were lucky. The bodies were usually just wrapped in cheap woven straw mats and buried maybe 3 feet deep under the soil. The kids dragged me right past those dirt mounds and pulled me toward the center of the main graveyard. I was terrified. The air felt colder in there, and the silence was just oppressive. But there were 6 of them, and only 1 of me, and I was so desperate to be part of the group that I kept my mouth shut and followed. Suddenly, the boy in the front stopped dead in his tracks and started pointing frantically toward a cluster of distant headstones. He started screaming about seeing a ghost in a flowing white dress floating above the graves. My heart hammered in my throat. I squinted and stared as hard as I could, but it was still bright outside, and there was absolutely nothing there. I was super confused. I turned around to tell them that I did not see anything at all, but the second I looked back, they were gone. They had completely ditched me. I saw them sprinting out the main gates, laughing their heads off as they disappeared down the street. The absolute panic that hit me was blinding. I was all alone in the middle of a graveyard. I did not even think. I just turned and ran as fast as my legs could carry me toward the exit. I was crying and hyperventilating, blindly charging through the mud and tall grass outside the gates. My vision was blurry from the tears, and I was not watching where I was stepping. I felt my right foot sink deep into something soft and spongy. There was this horrible squelching sound, and I lost my balance entirely, crashing face first into the wet earth. I had stepped right on top of what I thought was just a normal, massive mound of muddy dirt outside the gate. My foot had sunk deep into the side of the mound. I had absolutely zero clue it was an actual grave. I was too scared to care. I scrambled back to my feet, covered in brown sludge, and just kept running all the way home. When I burst through the front door, my mom took one look at me and started yelling about the mess. I was shivering and covered in graveyard mud. I did not tell her what really happened. I just mumbled some crappy excuse about slipping in a puddle, and she angrily sent me to the bathroom to scrub myself clean. It was not until I was standing in the shower that I noticed the pain in my foot. It felt exactly like stepping on a massive wooden splinter. You know that sharp, localized stinging sensation right in the deepest curve of your foot arch. It was incredibly annoying. I got out of the shower and spent the next 30 minutes sitting on my bed with a pair of nail clippers and tweezers, desperately trying to dig the splinter out. But no matter how hard I pressed on the skin or examined it under the light, I could not find a single dark spot or entry wound. It was just smooth, angry red skin. I had to limp when I walked out for dinner. My mom asked me why I was walking like that, and I lied again, telling her I probably just stepped on a thorn on the way home. She just rolled her eyes and told me to be more careful and to dig it out before it got infected. That night is when everything started to go wrong. My family was not well off, so my dad worked multiple jobs to keep us afloat. Once or twice a week, he would go out late at night to the local canals with an electric battery rig to catch fish and sell them at the morning market. He usually did not get back until 1 or 2 a.m. Because of my condition, my parents had given me my own room so I could have a quiet space to decompress. I had this large white mosquito net draped over my bed, which made everything outside of it look slightly blurry and hazy. It was storming really badly that night. The wind was howling, and the rain was lashing against the tin roof so hard it sounded like static. Normally, I am a very strict sleeper. I'd be completely knocked out by 9 or 10 p.m. But that night, it was probably around 11:40 p.m., and I could not sleep at all. My foot was throbbing with this bullshit hot ache. Every time I shifted my weight even a fraction of an inch, a sharp bolt of pain shot up my leg. I was just lying there staring at the ceiling when I heard the handle of my bedroom door click. The door slowly creaked open. There was no knock. I propped myself up on my elbows, looking through the thin white mesh of the mosquito net. The hallway light was off, but I could clearly see the silhouette of a man's head poking into my room. I immediately assumed it was my dad checking on me. I smiled and asked him if the storm had forced him to come home early. The head did not move. He did not say a word. I sat up completely, feeling a little confused. I crawled toward the edge of the bed and lifted the mosquito net to get a better look. That is when I noticed he was completely drenched. Water was pouring off his hair and face, hitting the floor tiles with this rhythmic, heavy dripping sound. I could not make out his facial features because the room was too dark, but seeing him soaking wet made me feel terrible. I loved my dad, and I thought he must be freezing cold from the rain. I told him to hold on and turned around to grab my towel from the back of the chair. When I turned back around a second later, the doorway was empty. I figured he had just gone to his own bedroom to dry off. I grabbed the towel and limped out into the hallway. I glanced toward the front of the house and noticed that my dad's old Honda motorbike was not parked in the living room where he always kept it. That meant he was not even home yet. My slow brain tried to process that information, but I just could not connect the dots. I hobbled over to my parents' bedroom and knocked lightly before opening the door. My mom was asleep. I woke her up and asked her where Dad went. She got really annoyed, asking me why I was waking her up in the middle of the night. I told her I just saw him looking into my room and that he was completely soaked, so I brought him a towel. She sighed heavily, telling me that he was probably waiting out the rain under some bridge and that I was just imagining things. She scolded me for worrying about him when I could not even take care of myself, and ordered me to go straight back to bed. I felt really stupid. I nodded, holding the towel, and gently closed her door. As I turned around to walk back to my room, I looked toward the living room. It was pitch black in there, but standing right in the middle of the room was the silhouette of a full-grown man. I could see his arms, his legs, his torso, but his face was just a void of shadows, and he was still dripping wet. The sound of the water hitting the floor was so loud in the quiet house. I was so incredibly naive that I still thought it was my dad. I held the towel out and took a step toward him, telling him Mom was mad and that he needed to dry off before he ruined the floor. I took one step forward, and the dark figure took one slow step backward. I kept walking toward him, holding out the towel and softly calling out to him, but he matched my pace perfectly, retreating backwards toward the front door. Our front door was an old design, made of wrought iron bars with a sheet of frosted glass layered over it so you could see outside. The figure backed up until his heels touched the bottom of the door frame. I took one more step, and with a sickening, effortless sliding motion, he just stepped backwards straight through the solid iron and glass. He literally clipped through the door like it was not even there. He stood on the outside porch for a few seconds, staring at me through the frosted glass, and then he just turned his head and walked away into the rain. I just stood there in the middle of the dark living room, holding a dry towel. It took my delayed brain almost 40 full seconds to process the absolute impossibility of what I had just witnessed. When it finally clicked that a solid human being cannot walk through metal, a wave of pure, paralyzing dread washed over my chest. The fear was so intense it actually made my vision tunnel. Instead of running to my mom and screaming, I was terrified of getting yelled at again, so I just bolted back to my room, threw myself under the covers, and cried silently into my pillow for 2 hours, until pure exhaustion finally knocked me out. The next morning, the situation with my foot went from annoying to genuinely alarming. The entire bottom of my foot had swollen into this massive, tight balloon of flesh. The arch was completely gone, puffed out so far that it was level with my heel. The skin was a furious, shiny red, and it radiated this intense, unnatural heat. I could not even put a sock on. I had to beg my mom to let me wear open-toed sandals to school. She inspected my foot for a long time, totally baffled as to how a tiny, invisible splinter could cause such massive swelling in just a few hours. School was absolute crap. I could not walk without wincing in agony. I spent the entire day glued to my desk, too scared of the pain to even walk to the cafeteria or the bathroom. When the lunch break hit, I didn't even move. I just put my face down on the desk and slept right through it because I was so exhausted from the pain. By the time the final bell rang and I limped my way back home, the swelling had gotten so bad that the bottom of my foot was literally thicker than my heel. My dad was home by then, and when he saw the state of my leg, he did not hesitate. He loaded me onto the back of his motorbike and drove me straight to the local medical clinic. The older doctor at the clinic took one look at my foot and frowned. He told my dad that this level of infection made 0 sense. If I had stepped on a piece of dirty wood, it would take days to fester and build up pus like this. The fact that it happened overnight meant there was something seriously screwed up. He decided he needed to do a minor surgery right then and there to get whatever was inside out. I was crying uncontrollably. As the nurses strapped my ankle down to the metal table, they gave me a local numbing shot, which burned like crazy. But after a few minutes, my entire foot went completely dead. I could not feel the scalpel cutting into the sole of my foot, but I could feel the strange, sickening pressure of the doctor digging around inside my flesh with a pair of metal forceps. The whole procedure took about 15 to 20 agonizing minutes. The room was totally silent except for my sniffling, and then I heard it. There was this sharp, distinct clinking sound as the doctor dropped a small, hard object onto the stainless steel surgical tray. My dad leaned over and asked what the hell kind of splinter was white. Wood and thorns are usually dark brown or black. The doctor picked the object back up with his tweezers and clicked on a small medical pen light, holding the object right up to his face. It was tiny, maybe 1/5 of an inch long, slightly thicker than a wooden toothpick. He muttered that it looked exactly like a piece of bone. He explained that fish bones are usually somewhat translucent, but this piece was dense and opaque, which meant it belonged to a mammal. He guessed maybe I had stepped on the remains of a rat or a stray cat. But even then, he was incredibly confused as to why animal bone would cause such a rapid, violent infection. He decided not to throw it away. He dropped the tiny white fragment into a plastic Ziploc bag and told my dad he wanted to keep it for a few days to examine it, just to figure out what kind of antibiotics I actually needed. They bandaged me up. The swelling immediately went down by half, and we went home. By the second night, my foot felt fantastic. The throbbing was completely gone. My dad was staying home that night, which made me feel incredibly safe. The rain had stopped entirely, and the evening was completely dry. I went to bed around 9 p.m., feeling totally relaxed. I was tossing and turning, trying to get comfortable, when I absent-mindedly stretched my legs out and accidentally kicked a small, soft teddy bear sitting at the foot of my bed. The pain that shot up my leg was so explosive and violent that I actually thought I had pissed myself. I gasped, throwing myself into a sitting position and grabbing my ankle. The swelling had returned instantly, and it was significantly worse than before the surgery. The skin felt so tight, I thought it was going to split open and bleed everywhere. I was in agony, but my slow brain convinced me that I should just wait until the morning to tell my dad, since the doctor told us to come back if it got worse anyway. I grabbed a long bolster pillow, carefully propped my swollen foot on top of it so it wouldn't touch the mattress, and forced my eyes closed until I eventually drifted off. I woke up sometime deep in the middle of the night. The handle of my bedroom door clicked. The hinges creaked. I opened my eyes and stared at the dark doorway. Heavy, dragging footsteps entered my room. The mosquito net was pulled back, and the mattress sank violently as the dark figure of a man climbed directly into my bed and laid down right next to me. I was so paralyzed by my own stupidity that I still, somehow, thought it was my dad. I figured maybe he had gone out for a late walk and gotten caught in a sudden shower. I could hear the wet, heavy squelching sounds of his soaked clothes pressing into the woven bamboo mat on my bed. Water was actively dripping off his body, hitting the floor tiles with a sickening slapping noise. I whispered to him, asking why he was sleeping in my room and complaining that my foot was hurting again. The man lying next to me did not say a word. He just breathed this cold, foul-smelling air into the room. I felt a wave of irritation, wondering why my dad would get into my bed without drying off first. I carefully shifted my injured foot on the pillow, turned my back to him, and faced the wall, trying to go back to sleep. A few agonizing minutes passed in total silence. I was just hovering on the edge of sleep when a voice spoke from directly behind my head. "Does it hurt?" The voice was gravelly, wet, and ancient. It was absolutely, undeniably not my father's voice. Every single hair on my body stood straight up. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the gut. The air in the room suddenly felt like freezing water. I was trapped, facing the wall, with an unknown, dripping entity lying inches from my spine. My voice shook violently as I asked him who the hell he was and demanded he get out of my room. He completely ignored my questions. He just kept repeating his own. "Does it hurt? Tell me, does the bottom of your foot hurt?" I was crying, begging him to leave, telling him my foot hurt so badly, but that he needed to get out of my house. I tried to pull my legs away from him, terrified that his wet clothes would touch my skin. Then, his voice dropped into this hateful, furious growl. "Do you see this water? Do you see how soaking wet I am? This is because of you. You stepped on my grave and punched a massive hole right through my roof. The rain flooded my home for days, and you did not even know, did you? You ruined my home, and now I am wet because of you." My mind completely fractured. I slammed my hands over my ears, squeezed my eyes shut, and screamed at the absolute top of my lungs. I was screaming for my mom, screaming for my dad, screaming for anyone to help me, screaming the word fuck over and over, as pure, primal survival instinct took over my paralyzed body. Within seconds, I heard the thunderous pounding of my parents running down the hallway. The bedroom light flicked on, blinding me. My dad burst through the door and immediately slipped and almost cracked his head open on a massive, unexplainable puddle of water pooled right beside my bed. He thought I had peed myself from the pain. My mom yanked me out of the bed, holding me as I hyperventilated and babbled about the wet man. They could see I was experiencing a complete mental breakdown. My dad figured moms were just naturally better at dealing with terrified kids, so he stayed behind to mop up the mysterious puddle while my mom dragged me into their bedroom. I curled into a ball on her bed and recounted every single terrifying detail. Because my brain was wired so weirdly, I actually remembered exactly what people said, word for word. I repeated that dead guy's exact words back to her. I told her about the hole in the grave, the flooded water, the wet clothes. At first, she thought I was just having a fever dream from the infection, but the sheer accuracy and horror in my voice finally broke through. She held me tight to her chest and started quietly chanting Buddhist prayers, whispering them into my hair until the sun finally came up. The next morning, my foot looked like a rotting eggplant. The swelling had traveled all the way up to my ankle, and the skin was so tight that it felt like it would explode if you poked it with a needle. My mom sat me down, and interrogated me about what I had done earlier that week. I finally broke down and confessed everything about the bullies, the graveyard, and stepping on the dirt mound in the mud. She turned pale, immediately realizing what I had actually stepped on. My parents rushed me to the cemetery and tracked down the groundskeeper. When they found the cluster of cheap dirt graves outside the gate, they saw exactly what the ghost had described. Right on the side of one of the unmarked mounds was a deep, shoe-shaped hole. Because it had been pouring rain for days, water had funneled directly into that hole. The grave was completely waterlogged, the muddy water bubbling and squelching around the buried remains. The groundskeeper explained that those graves were incredibly shallow, maybe 3 feet deep. He told my parents that there were 2 ways to handle this. Option 1 was the cheap route. Just pump the water out, patch the dirt, and burn some incense to apologize. But he looked at me, seeing how fragile and weak my spirit was, and strongly suggested option 2. Because a piece of the dead man's actual bone had pierced my skin and stayed inside my flesh, it created a direct physical link. That was how the ghost tracked me all the way to my bedroom. If we didn't sever that tie completely, the ghost would eventually drive me insane. The groundskeeper knew we were struggling financially, so he offered to do the full exhumation and reburial for a heavy discount. My parents had to borrow money from relatives to afford it. Because the guy's skeleton had already completely fallen apart in the mud, we didn't even need a full-sized casket. We only had to buy this tiny wooden coffin, barely a meter long, just to pack his loose bones into. When the groundskeeper dug up the body, he noted that the bones were already stained a deep yellow. He told my dad that bones usually take 20 years to turn that color, but this guy had only been buried for about 7. The grave had clearly been leaking water long before I ever stepped on it. He wasn't some grand demon. He was just some pissed-off dead guy looking for an excuse to torture a slow kid into buying him a better house. A few days later, we went back to the clinic to get more antibiotics. The swelling was finally going down, but before we could leave, that older doctor pulled out the little plastic Ziploc bag with the white fragment. He looked at my parents with this deeply disturbed expression and asked if I had been wandering around any graveyards, because he had examined the piece under a microscope. He told us, point blank, that it wasn't an animal bone at all. It was a tiny piece of a human pinky toe. My stomach completely dropped. We took that tiny bag straight to the cemetery, and since the workers were still finishing up the brickwork for his new proper grave, we just handed it over to them so they could pack it into the wooden box with the rest of his remains. We basically returned his missing piece, just to get him to leave me the hell alone. Physically, the infection cleared up after a few more days of meds. And mentally, my parents were so furious about the whole prank that they marched straight into the school to confront my teachers, making sure everyone knew to keep those bullies away from me. The bullying stopped immediately. I got better, and by the time I hit high school, my cognitive delays completely vanished, and I was just a normal kid. But the thing is, ever since that week, I physically cannot sleep with a blanket over my feet. It doesn't matter how cold it gets, because the second the fabric touches my soles, I swear I can still feel the damp, freezing weight of his wet body pressing down on me.